Picture a man going to work every morning, knowing his job was more likely to kill him than the Western Front in World War I. Not the front lines in France, not the trenches, the mine. In West Virginia, in 1917. That is not a metaphor. There's a documented statistic, and it is one of 25 things about Appalachian coal miners that almost no one teaches anymore. Not in school. Not in documentaries. Not in any history your grandparents were allowed to pass down to you. Some of this was buried by corporate lawyers. Some of it was crushed under martial law. Some of it simply drowned in the noise of a country that moved on and never looked back. By the time this video is done, you will understand why a man named Sid Hatfield was shot dead on courthouse steps in broad daylight in front of his wife by the same private army that had been terrorizing miners for 30 years, and why almost nobody remembers his name today. Number 25. Let's start counting. West Virginia, 1869. Fewer than 1,600 coal miners in the entire state. The mountains are full of coal. 300 million years of compressed ancient swamp packed into seams, but nobody has figured out how to move it at scale yet. Then the railroads come. Between 1880 and 1900, competing rail lines carve routes through the Appalachian Mountains. Explodes. 489,000 tons in 1869. 89,384,000 tons by 1917. At peak, Appalachia produced 2/3 of the nation's coal, 2/3 of the fuel that ran the factories, heated the homes, powered the steel mills. The men who dug it out were paid in currency that could only be spent at one store. They worked in conditions so dangerous, the state did not bother enforcing its own safety laws. And when they tried to organize an armored train with a machine gun was waiting. This was their world. 25 pieces of it that got buried. These are not footnotes. Every item on this list is documented government records, Library of Congress archives, National Park Service histories, Smithsonian research. This is what Appalachian coal miners actually lived, starting with what they ate for lunch. Number 1. The pepperoni roll. The Country Club Bakery in Fairmont, West Virginia, is credited with inventing it, a soft bread roll stuffed with cured pepperoni designed so a miner could eat underground, in the dark, with one hand. No table, no plate, no spoilage. That last part is the engineering. Cured pepperoni does not spoil at room temperature. In an era before refrigerators, a man working 2,000 feet underground could not bring something that went bad. The roll was a solution to a food safety problem specific to underground labor, invented by a bakery that understood what miners actually needed. West Virginia still calls it the unofficial state food. Most people think it is just a regional quirk. What the miner carried it in tells an even older story. Number 2. The tin dinner bucket. Every miner carried 2 compartments, tea sealed below to stay warm against the man's body heat, food above. What history class never told you is that these buckets absorbed the smell of coal dust permanently. No washing removed it. After a few weeks underground, the tin smelled completely of the mine. The food inside carried that smell too. Some miners packed extra food deliberately. If a miner was killed underground, the food was already packed. If he came home safe, the leftovers were a treat for the children. The company canteen systems introduced after World War II replaced the dinner bucket. Convenient, sanitary. And they erased one of the most specific physical objects of mining life. A container that smelled permanently of the work it served. The miner bought that bucket with money the company had already decided how he was allowed to spend. Coal scrip. The version you have heard is the cover story. Here is the real system. Coal scrip was company-printed currency, paper coupons or metal tokens, redeemable only at company-owned stores. Over 20,000 company stores operated across North America at peak. The Stearns Company alone ran 15 stores in Kentucky and Tennessee, with total retail business reaching $1 million in 1928. The trap inside the trap. Middlemen bought scrip from miners who needed cash at 75 cents on the dollar, then redeemed it from the company for 90 cents. The miner absorbed the loss. In Fentress County, Tennessee, scrip was routinely discounted 25 to 50%. The Stearns Company continued using scrip until 1964. The currency was fake. The wages were real, but engineered to be worth less than they looked. Number 4. The per-ton pay system. Miners were paid by weight of coal produced, not hours worked. A miner who spent 2 hours in a bad section, low roof, thin seam, wet rock, produced nothing and was paid nothing. Average wages were $852 per year in 1923. By 1933, that had collapsed to $235, a 72% drop in a decade, while rent and company store bills held constant. The per-ton system externalized market risk entirely onto the worker while keeping operator margins stable. That was not an accident. It was a design choice. The man taking that wage home lived in a house owned by the same company that paid him. Number 5. The company town. At peak in 1930, nearly 500 company-owned coal towns existed in West Virginia alone. Over 80% of West Virginia miners rented from coal companies. The company owned the housing, the store, the school, the church, the post office. And here is the part that gets buried. When a miner went on strike, he risked not just his job but his home, his family's food supply, his children's school. Total economic dependency, deliberately constructed to make resistance as costly as possible. The company town was not convenience housing. It was a control system. Inside those towns, in the years before labor laws, children worked. Number 6, breaker boys. Boys as young as 8 sorted coal from rock and slate on conveyor belts, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for pennies. The noise from machinery was loud enough that they communicated by gesture. Their fingers bled from sharp slate edges. Many went partially deaf. Black lung started accumulating from the first shift. The breaker boss enforced pace with a stick. The 1916 Keating-Owen Child Labor Act was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1918 as unconstitutional. Substantive federal child labor protection did not arrive until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Between the 1880s and 1930s, breaker boys were standard, documented practice. Their existence was known. Photographs were taken. Nobody with documented authority intervened for 50 years. Underground, the men who replaced those boys used light that seemed almost medieval. Number 7, carbide lamps. Water dripped onto calcium carbide crystals produced acetylene gas, feeding a small brass flame, bright, steady white light, better than older oil lamps. And here is the part that gets buried. The miner was personally responsible for maintaining it, refilling the carbide, adjusting the water drip rate for the right flame intensity. He also paid for his own carbide out of wages. The carbide lamp served as an informal gas detector. The flame changed color in the presence of certain gases. Experienced miners read their flames the way a sailor reads wind. That flame was doing something else. The miner was reading whether the air would kill him. Number 8. The death rate. Between 1890 and 1912, West Virginia mines had the highest miner death rates in the United States. Every year. Consistently. During World War I, West Virginia miners were, by some documented accounts, dying faster than soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force in France. A man who stayed home and went to work in a coal mine was more likely to die than a man who shipped to the Western Front. Read that again, slowly. The National Park Service documented why. West Virginia had mine safety laws that were the weakest in the country, with few or any provisions to ensure their enforcement. Roof falls. Methane explosions. Slow building squeeze from subsurface pressure, dropping tons of ceiling without warning. Mine operators lobbied state legislators. Mine operators owned state legislators. The weakest safety laws in the country were not an oversight. They were a policy choice made by people who profited from the lack of enforcement. Some miners developed their own early warning system, passed down between generations, never in any safety manual. Number 9. The roof knock. Experienced miners could detect dangerous ceiling sections before they fell rap. The pick handle against the mine's ceiling. A solid seam returns a flat, dense thud. Loose slate, rock separated from the main body, held in place only by friction, returns a hollow, ringing sound. Miners called it drumming. You could hear the difference clearly after a few weeks underground. This technique was passed miner to miner, father to son, experienced hand to new worker, never in any safety manual. Embodied knowledge, the kind that lives in the doing, not the writing. New workers who had not learned to hear the difference were most at risk in roof fall incidents. The men who taught the roof knock were often not American-born. Number 10. Welsh miners. Wales had been mining coal since the 1600s. Welsh miners brought accumulated technique, pillar and stall layout, ventilation management, methane detection, and by 1900, over 100,000 Welsh immigrants lived in western Pennsylvania alone. They brought the roof knock, the canary test, a dozen practices that saved lives. What history class never told you? The same railroad expansion that brought them also brought a cheaper second wave. Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, workers who would accept worse terms. Welsh specialized expertise was made redundant by scale. By the 1920s, the distinctively Welsh influence on Appalachian mining culture had largely dissolved into the general labor pool. Those miners left behind a record almost nobody has listened to. Number 11. The 40 cents a week songs. Miners sang about their lives with exact numbers. How do you live on 40 cents a week? Not a figure of speech, but documentation. The Library of Congress holds recordings from 1940 made by folklorist George Corson. Miners singing about tonnage wages, company scales, disasters, evictions, naming specific operators and specific dollar amounts. As the UMW moved into mainstream labor in the 1930s and 1940s, the most radical imagery was quietly set aside. The songs were not banned. They were simply not promoted, not taught, not passed on. The archive exists. Most Americans have no idea it is there. The wages those songs described were connected to a fight over one specific number. Number 12. The 9-hour workday. Before 1912, West Virginia coal miners worked 10 to 12 hours underground. 6 days a week, no overtime, wages by tonnage only. There is a reason this stopped being taught. The victory did not hold. On April 18, 1912, 7,500 miners walked out at Paint Creek Cabin Creek in Kanawha County. 15 months of striking. The July 1913 compromise included the 9-hour day, a real documented win. By 1929, after Blair Mountain destroyed the UMW in West Virginia, membership had fallen from 50,000 to 600. The 9-hour win was reversed in practice. 30 years of organizing gains erased in approximately 9 years. While miners fought over hours, their families were growing food to survive the wages from the shifts they did work. Number 13. The Coal Camp Garden. On wages of $235 per year in the Depression, a family could not buy all their food from the company store at company prices. A garden reduced dependence on scrip. Hog butchering was communal, neighbors working together, splitting the meat. Green beans were dried into leather breeches. Ginseng was harvested from the hillsides for sale outside the company system. Moonshine ran alongside legitimate farming as income that did not touch company currency. After World War II, suburbanization and supermarket expansion eroded the communal knowledge and land access that had made the practice a survival system. During the worst of the strikes, the garden was not enough, so miners built something larger. Number 14. The Union Canteen. During the 1912 Paint Creek strike, the UMW was feeding 35,000 people across tent camp networks. Miners evicted from company housing. 3 days' notice, families removed by Baldwin Felts agents, had lost everything. The union built parallel infrastructure, collective kitchens, common food stores, a supply chain entirely outside the company system. Coal companies prohibited striking miners from using company-owned roads, bridges, and utilities. Total economic encirclement. The tent camp infrastructure was the direct response. Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, in her mid-70s, organized in those tents. She was arrested under martial law and imprisoned without trial. Inside those same camps were miners whose presence in the coal fields had a history of its own. Number 15. Nuttleburg. In 1900, African Americans made up over 55% of the population in some West Virginia coal camps. More than half. This does not appear in most American history courses. Companies recruited black workers from the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia, specifically as counter-pressure to white union organizing. At Nuttleburg in 1890, 110 company houses, a community divided by Short Creek, segregated schools running 5 to 6 months per year. And here is the paradox the history books do not adequately address. During the mine wars of 1912 to 1921, this same region became one of the only places in America where black and white children attended school together, specifically in Matawan. Miners facing a common enemy organized across the color line in ways most American towns in 1920 would not have recognized. Underground, beside all those miners regardless of race, sat a cage. Number 16. Mine canaries. Canaries were more sensitive to carbon monoxide than humans. They fell unconscious before the concentration reached dangerous levels for a man. That gap was the warning window. Miners watched the bird. If it went down, immediate evacuation. The British government officially phased out canary use in coal mines in 1986. Not because they were ineffective, because electronic gas detectors are faster, continuous, and do not require any living thing to be sacrificed. The canaries were not replaced because they failed. They were replaced because electronics do not die. The canaries fell silent in a year when everything was already changing underground. Number 17. The Bull Moose Express. Stop. Because this is where the story changes register. Everything up to this point was structural, economic violence, legal, and sustained. What I am about to describe is different. This is the moment coal companies put a machine gun on a train, and drove it into a civilian neighborhood. 1912. Paint Creek Strike. An armored train was driven through miners' tents at night. It opened fire. One miner killed. His name was Chesco Estep. No operator was arrested. No operator was charged. The governor of West Virginia declared martial law, not to prosecute the operators who built the armored train, but to seize weapons from the miners. The catalog: 1,872 rifles, 556 pistols, 6 machine guns, 225,000 rounds, 480 blackjacks. The miners had been armed. The coal operators had been armed. The state chose to disarm the miners. Mother Jones was arrested under that martial law and imprisoned without trial. A United States senator read her statement to the Senate. The federal government acknowledged the situation, then sided with the operators. The Bull Moose Express is not in your history textbook because the people who built it were never held accountable. That accountability gap is the story. The company that organized it used private agents who had been operating in the coal fields for years. Number 18. Mother Jones. Mary Harris Jones was in her late 70s during the 1912 Paint Creek Strike, old enough to be most miners' grandmother. She had survived her husband and 4 children dying of yellow fever in Memphis in 1867. The Chicago fire burning everything she owned in 1871. 30 years of organizing before Paint Creek. What history class never told you? She was imprisoned under military tribunal jurisdiction, not civilian court. No formal charge, no civilian trial. A U.S. senator read her statement to the Senate. The military tribunal extended her detention in response. The machinery of state. Martial law, military courts, federal troops deployed at governor's request was systematically available to operators and systematically unavailable to miners. By design, not by failure. The agents she was fighting had a name and a corporate structure. Number 19. Baldwin Felts. Most people have never heard of them. In the coalfields of West Virginia, and Kentucky, from 1890 to the 1930s, they were the primary mechanism of corporate violence. Over 300 armed agents at peak. Standard toolkit, 3-day eviction notices served to miners' families, physical removal by agents, guards at mine entrances, beatings of organizers. And here is the part that gets buried. At Ludlow, Colorado, in 1914, Baldwin Felts agents and Colorado National Guard troops burned a mining camp cellar where women and children had taken shelter. 19 killed, including 11 children. Major newspapers covered it. Not a single Baldwin Felts agent was prosecuted. The agency survived as a functioning corporate private police force into the 1930s. In one town, they met a police chief who had decided not to play along. Number 20. Matewan, May 19, 1920. Baldwin Felts agents arrived in Matewan, West Virginia, to evict miners from company housing. Standard procedure until Chief of Police Sid Hatfield told them the evictions were illegal. 10 people died in what followed. Mayor Cabell Testerman, 2 miners, 7 Baldwin Felts agents, including Al and Lee Felts, brothers of the agency's chief. Sid Hatfield was tried for murder. Acquitted. The jury of Mingo County took less than an hour. Hatfield became a symbol, a local lawman who refused to serve as a corporate instrument. That symbol needed to be destroyed. The destruction came 14 months later. Number 21. The tent colonies. Miners and their families, children, elderly, newborns, lived in union-supplied tents for months after eviction, through winter. The 1912 martial law seizure gives you the picture of those camps. 1,872 rifles, 556 pistols, 6 machine guns, 225,000 rounds taken from the miners. They expected attack. In many cases, they had already been attacked. After Matewan, through 1920 and 1921, more miners were arrested, union organizers imprisoned, martial law declared in Mingo County. Sid Hatfield was scheduled to appear at McDowell County Courthouse on August 1, 1921, on a charge most miners believed was fabricated to create an opportunity. Baldwin Felts agents were waiting on the courthouse steps. Hatfield arrived unarmed. He was shot dead in front of his wife. Ed Chambers was shot alongside him. No agent was ever convicted. The death of Sid Hatfield was the match. Number 22. The bombing. Logan County Sheriff Don Chaffin assembled 2,000 county police, state militia volunteers, and Baldwin Felts agents along Blair Mountain Ridge with machine gun positions on the high ground. He also rented aircraft and loaded them with improvised explosive devices, homemade pipe bombs, and, by some accounts, surplus ordnance left over from World War I. Those planes flew over columns of advancing miners and dropped the bombs. The year is 1921. American miners, many of them veterans of that same war, bombed from the air with repurposed World War I ordnance by a county sheriff financially backed by coal companies. The first documented use of aircraft to bomb American civilians on United States soil. Then the federal government arrived. Number 23. Blair Mountain. August 24, 1921. Between 10,000 and 20,000 armed miners began marching from Marmot toward Logan and Mingo counties. 60 miles on foot through mountain terrain. Marching to free miners imprisoned in Mingo County. Marching 3 weeks after watching what happened to Sid Hatfield on courthouse steps. The miners organized without publicly naming a leader, swore each other to secrecy about leadership structure, specifically to prevent legal targeting. No single general to cut off. Collective action at maximum scale. Sheriff Chaffin's 2,000 defenders held the ridgeline. Bombing aircraft flew sorties. For 8 days, one of the largest battles on American soil since the Civil War was fought in the mountains of West Virginia. On September 2, 1921, President Warren G. Harding ordered 2,500 federal troops to Blair Mountain, equipped with machine guns, and, per documented accounts, World War I surplus gas bombs. The miners stood down. Many of them were veterans of the same war, whose surplus weapons were now pointed at them. One miner said as his unit retreated, "It was Uncle Sam did it. Not the sheriff, not the governor. The United States government." The Battle of Blair Mountain ended not because miners lost to coal companies. It ended because the federal government chose the coal companies. The legal aftermath was designed to finish what the Army had started. Number 24. The Treason Trials. In 1922, West Virginia, working with private coal companies, indicted over 500 miners on charges of murder, insurrection, and treason. Treason. American workers marching to free imprisoned colleagues charged with treason against the United States. The trials were moved to Jefferson County Courthouse in Charlestown, more than 300 miles from Blair Mountain. West Virginia legislation passed immediately after Blair Mountain allowed criminal cases to be moved to counties where juries would be hostile. That courthouse had a specific history. It was where John Brown was tried in 1859. The message was not subtle. Approximately 550 miners were ultimately convicted. Here is the number that tells you everything. UMW membership in West Virginia stood at 50,000 in 1920. By 1929, it had fallen to 600. 30 years of organizing, Paint Creek, the 9-hour day, the mutual aid networks, functionally destroyed in less than a decade. The men who marched believed they were fighting for the right to organize peacefully. The government that deployed 2,500 troops against them agreed formally that the right existed, then deployed the army anyway. What happened to the communities they left behind is a second story almost as long as the first. Number 25. The Hillbilly Highway. The word hillbilly first appeared in print in 1899. The New York Journal described it as a free and untrammeled white citizen of Alabama who lives in the hills, has no means to speak of. The same year, the coal boom was pulling tens of thousands of workers into Appalachia. The slur and the exploitation arrived at the same historical moment. After World War II, longwall automation and continuous mining machines deployed widely in the 1950s eliminated approximately 50,000 mining jobs across Appalachia. Men whose fathers and grandfathers had fought at Blair Mountain and survived the treason trials found that the work was simply gone. The industry that had suppressed every reform automated around the workers it no longer needed. They left. Hundreds of thousands of Mishmen sprayed to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Cincinnati. Route 23 from eastern Kentucky north toward Ohio became the Hillbilly Highway, a phrase that began as a slur now weaponized by northern urban populations against the migrants arriving in their cities. Historian Elizabeth Cott wrote in 2018, "The story of Appalachia cannot be separated from the story of the United States. The coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution, the labor suppression that wrote the template for anti-union law, the treason charges, the automation, the migration, every piece of this was American, all 25 of them. So why do most Americans not know any of this? Between roughly 1921 and 1955, three overlapping mechanisms worked together. First, direct legal suppression. The treason convictions after Blair Mountain were not just punitive, they were a message. 550 convicted. UMW membership fell from 50,000 to 600 in 9 years. The people who led the organizing were dead, imprisoned, or driven out. The institutional vehicle for transmitting this history was destroyed. Second, corporate capture of narrative infrastructure. Coal operators owned the company towns, which meant they owned the schools and the churches. For 2 generations of Appalachian children, local history was company history. The curriculum did not include the Bull Moose Express. It did not include the treason trials. It did not include what happened to Sid Hatfield. Third, the Hillbilly Highway itself erased communities. The migration scattered Appalachian families into industrial cities where the hillbilly slur followed them. First-generation migrants were often ashamed of the identity being used against them. They did not teach their children the history, because that history was attached to something being weaponized against them. The grandchildren of men who marched at Blair Mountain grew up in Cleveland and Detroit with no knowledge of what their grandparents had fought for. What finished the job was national historical silence. Blair Mountain does not appear in most American history textbooks. The West Virginia mine wars are not on most curricula. Not buried by any single decision, buried by the accumulated weight of 100 decisions made by people who found the history inconvenient. 50,000 to 600. That is how fast organized resistance can be destroyed when private capital and state power align against it together. None of this is entirely past. The West Virginia Mine Wars Museum in Matewan still has bullet holes in its walls from the 1920 shootout. The building is standing. The holes are there. That is how recent this is. The Blair Mountain battlefield has been at the center of a preservation fight since 2009. Coal companies have proposed surface mining operations on the site. The battle over whether to mine Blair Mountain is ongoing. The black lung data is the most alarming modern connection. Research cited by Smithsonian finds 1 in 5 long-tenured miners in central Appalachia has coal workers' pneumoconiosis today. In 2016, a single small clinic in Kentucky documented 60 cases of progressive massive fibrosis, the most disabling form, in just 20 months. In 2016, Kentucky changed its law limiting allowable medical testimony in black lung cases. The documented diagnosis rate for state-examined Kentucky miners fell from 54% to 26% between 2016 and 2020. The disease did not change. The law did. Mine supervisors, according to documented testimony, instructed workers to tamper with dust pumps, wrapping rags around them, placing them in dinner buckets, hanging them in fresh air to falsify air quality readings. The dinner bucket from earlier on this list, still being used to hide the evidence that the air is killing the man working in it. The Library of Congress American Folklife Center still holds George Corson's 1940 recordings of Appalachian miners' songs. Publicly accessible. No credentials required. You can request digital access from home. The archive exists. It was never hidden, just not surfaced. If you are the kind of person who finds this valuable, who wants the specific names, the specific dates, the verified numbers rather than the sanitized summary, then you already know there are very few places on YouTube providing this. The next video in this series goes deeper into a specific event that came up several times in this list. The Farmington mine disaster of 1968. 78 miners killed. The disaster that finally forced passage of the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, the first comprehensive federal mine safety legislation in American history, and what the coal industry did in the years immediately afterward to weaken it before it could take effect. The people who ran the company towns in 1920 relied on miners being isolated from each other and from the larger world. They controlled the store, the school, the church, the road, the currency. The one thing they could not control was information that moved outside the company system. That is what this channel is, 100 years later. The history in this video has been sitting in the Library of Congress and National Park Service archives for decades, not hidden by being